Alright, so today we're diving into another corner of the Warhammer 40k universe, another Primarch planet, one which was rather short-lived. And honestly, this planet itself is rather unsettling. Today we're talking about Colchis. Now, if you look at the official Imperial records today, you aren't going to find much. It's just listed as a dead world. But it's significantly worse than that. It's a ghost. It's a planet that the Inquisition spent thousands of years trying to scrub from the map, and that is for a very good reason. This is a homeworld of Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Wordbearers, and in essence, it is ground zero for the greatest tragedy in human history. Before things got really dark, Colchis was actually a bit of a mystery. It started out as a highly technologically advanced civilization, but by the time our story really begins, it had regressed back to a feudal state for no apparent reason. Imagine a world where people are living amongst the rusted skeletal remains of starships and ancient ruins they no longer understood, but were exposed to every single day. This was a harsh, dry world orbited by an incredible 19 natural satellites. Can you imagine the sight of the night sky just to see 19 individual moons passing by? It must have felt like the heavens were constantly watching you. Which is fitting because the entire culture was obsessed with religion. At the heart of this world was the convent of Colchis. This was a massive planet-wide religious bureaucracy that controlled everything. When Lorgar's pod crashed, he wasn't found by some kind farmer. He wasn't found by some derelict mutant struggling to survive. He was found by a tribe which was eventually slaughtered by Corferon, a man who, to put it lightly, was really not a good guy. And he saw in Lorgar potential, one which he could use to lead a massive, bloody, holy war in order to overthrow the Covenant. A war which Lorgar eventually won, uniting the planet under his own iteration of faith. But this is one of those be careful what you wish for scenarios, because when the Emperor showed up to save his son, he brought Colchis into the Imperium, giving them advanced technology and a seat at the table. For a second, it looked like Colchis was going to have a truly happy ending. But we know everything in 40k being 40k, the concept of a golden age lasting more than a fortnight is silly. And when the Emperor took Lorgar away to lead his legion, he basically left Colchis to rot. Without their God King, or their God King's sire, there to keep things running, the planet immediately started sliding back into a feudal broken state. Imperial traffic began to entirely avoid this system. There were even rumors of ships disappearing, specifically that of the 2188th Expeditionary Fleet, and the orbital infrastructure just magically crumbling. This became a lowly, superstitious place once again. But this time, there was a darker seed planted in the soil. When the Horus Heresy finally kicked off, Colchis didn't just stand on the sidelines. Loyalists to Corferon quickly seized power and started a bloody purge that honestly seems a little hard to describe without being censored. But basically they tried to build their own miniature empire in the stars, which led to what historians call the Bitter War. This wasn't a clean fight, but rather a desperate, grueling struggle that lasted for years. By the time the Ultramarines finally showed up to clean up the mess that was left by the Horus Heresy, they didn't find a place worth saving. They found a world that had completely collapsed under the weight of its own zealotry. The ending of Colchis is what really seals its legacy as a nightmare. The Inquisition saw this world and didn't want to conquer it. They didn't even want to send ships down to the surface for much longer than needed. Instead, they decided to use a volley of cyclonic torpedoes, which is basically the Imperium's delete button for entire planet. But here's the crazy part. Due to Colchis' unique geological makeup, the torpedoes didn't just burn the surface. They caused the entire planet to literally fracture and explode into smithereens. It didn't just die. The world shattered into pieces. Today, there's nothing left but a field of debris and a secret file in an inquisitorial vault. Now going into further detail. Colchis is a world that was functionally forgotten, and it's a really weird way that it happened. To understand why Colchis broke its people, we have to understand who exactly lived there and the physical reality of the world. The world itself was massive, meaning the gravity would have been notably higher. We're talking about a planet 3 times the size of Terra. Because of that scale and weight, everything was slowed down. It took nearly 5 Terran years just to go around the sun once, and a single day A single rotation of this planet on its axis took approximately 170.4 hours. That's a terrifying time for a human to stay awake or asleep. You can't just have a Tuesday on Colchis, as the concept of such a time would cause your mind to break. To cope with this, the Colchians developed a timekeeping system that sounds like something straight out of a high fantasy novel, and their timekeeping system broke their massive days into 7 sub-days: dawn day, morn day, long noon, post noon, dusk eve, cold fall, and high night. They even went so far as into breaking down and restructuring wake, rise, and rest eve into segments just to keep their biological clocks functioning. Since, even though there were extraterrestrials, these individuals were still human, necessitating the basic human needs, which had evolved to function with the basic human timetable. This was a world where the sun literally hung from the sky for what feels like the better part of a week. This creates a grueling, stagnant atmosphere that really sets the stage for the kind of obsessive religious mindset that the world became famous for. The geography of the planet itself was also a nightmare, as it was covered with jagged mountains and endless drought-wrecked deserts. If you weren't living on the coast, you were basically waiting to die slowly of dehydration or sunstroke. Because the equatorial heat was literally too much for humans to survive, the civilization huddled together in these massive city-states. The crown jewel of all of these was Vharadesh, also known as the City of Grey Flowers. And this is the part that actually makes the whole story kind of sad. Despite all the grimdark stuff, Colchis had a beautiful bit of nature known as the moon lily. These were silver and white wildflowers that evolved to reflect the harsh sunlight, stunting their own growth just to survive the heat. And they were everywhere in Vharadesh, hanging from balconies and spires, giving this holy city a shimmering, ghostly appearance. To the people there, these flowers were everything. They were seen both as gifts for lovers and symbols of hope. The classic bit of 40k irony coming from the fact that this beautiful, fragile culture blooming on the surface was actually secretly slowly rotting from the inside out. But now we have to talk about the social side of things, because the real conspiracy starts to develop, not within the world itself, but within the cities that were run by the Covenant. This was a massive theocracy that basically used religion to justify a brutal system of chattel slavery. If you weren't part of the religious machine, you would be cast out into the desert. These outcasts were called the Declined, and the Covenant thought that they were literally damned by the Great Powers. Ironically enough, we later found out that the Great Powers were just an iteration or a interpretation of the 4 ruinous gibbering gods: Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and Nurgle. Now, looking back, we see that this old faith weren't just made up gods, and the people of Colchis were unintentionally breathing in the fumes and the corrupting essence of the warp. They were living on a literal ticking time bomb of corruption, disguised as a holy tradition. Funnily enough, Lorgar attempted to change all this. There's a famous golden plaque that used to hang on the doors of the Spiral Temple in Vharadesh, where Lorgar promised the Emperor he would serve the Imperium as long as Colchis would remain a planet of peace and prosperity, as the man genuinely strived to separate his people from the old faith, and he generally wanted to save his world. But in the end, his peace was built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and frustration, along with an uncountable amount of fanatical devotion, which he instilled in his people, ironically being what led to the Inquisition eventually hitting the delete button. Now, to understand the importance of Colchis in the Great Game, you have to know that this was one of the very first worlds that humanity ever touched during the Dark Age of technology. And it sits right at the edge of Segmentum Pacificus, staring out into the literal darkness of the void. But here's the thing, by the time the Imperium rediscovered the planet, it was essentially a graveyard of its own former glory. The continents were all covered in these massive crumbling structures that nobody, not even the smartest in the Mechanicum, could figure out. They were just there. They didn't seem quite made of human technology, but they didn't seem like they came from any form of Xenos. Functionally, these were truly alien in appearance and functionality, especially to the people living in their shadows. And it wasn't just the ground. If you looked up into the Colchisian sky, you'd see these 19 moons we talked about before. And you'd also see dead husks of ancient starships, along with wreckages of interstellar shipyards, just drifting in orbit, almost like ghost ships locked in a slow motion fall that would take an eternity to finish. It was such a haunting image, especially for a society of spear-wielding feudal peasants living underneath the rusted skeletons of a galactic empire they didn't even remember being a part of. This regression from a high-tech utopia to a pre-industrial old faith culture is what gave the Coven their power. They stepped into the ruins and told people, don't worry, a great leader is coming to save us from the darkness. They built this monolithic, suffocating dogma out of the wreckage of the past, using the imagery and the iconography of humanity's bygone golden age. Now, usually when the Imperium brings a world into the fold, they turn it into a veritable fortress. They built orbital weapon platforms, refueling stations, massive shipyards, all to keep the Great Crusade moving. However, Colchis was a little bit different. Colchis refused. Even after Lorgar was found, the planet remained largely isolated. There were no orbital bases, no massive industrial hubs to feed fleets. It was a world that stubbornly remained insular, almost like it was trying to hide itself from the rest of the galaxy. Because of this lack of infrastructure and some really creepy rumors about unreliable ship lanes, most Imperial captains just stayed away. There's an actual record of the 2,188th Expeditionary Fleet disappearing entirely in that sector, just gone, almost as if the warp swallowed it up. Things like this kept everyone at arm's length from the world proper. It was this isolation that created a pressure cooker of religious fanaticism. While the rest of the Imperium was moving towards science and the imperial truth, Colchis was doubling down on its own ancient and holy traditions. In the city of Grey Flowers, they were secretly integrating the old faith and the worship of the old gods into every system they could. The irony that Colchis would eventually mirror the world of Kur, where the Emperor brought Lorgar to his knees and forced him to watch his favorite city, his shining example of everything he believed in, burnt to the ground because he was too slow and his religion had gone too far. The irony of this happening to Lorgar's own homeworld cannot be ignored. And again, much like Kur, Colchis believed that they were the cradle of civilization, but in reality they were just the latest layer of paint in a world that had already died a dozen times before. And when you realize their great leader, Prophecy, was actually a beacon, nay, a sign of one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy coming to their world, their whole religion seems to become a sick joke, one which would develop into a cosmic horror story as their entire world was reduced to naught but ash. Now let's move on to the Golden Sun of Colchis, because things get a little weird when involving Lorgar. The planet that Lorgar ruled over was incredibly stubborn. Lorgar had allowed the Mechanicum to come and pick through the debris of the ships orbiting the world like a junkyard, but that was pretty much it. Imperial commanders would be outright told that the area wasn't haunted because that was superstition, then proceed to never fly their ships or even allow merchant ships near the world. Somehow, Lorgar was able to manage to turn the world and this entire sector of space into the loneliest corner in the Imperium. And right in the front doors of the Spire Temple of the Covenant, there was a massive golden plaque, which reportedly recorded the exact words that Lorgar spoke to the Emperor when they first met. It was a promise of loyalty. The irony of Lorgar swearing loyalty to the Emperor is not lost on anyone. Now, Lorgar never actually confirmed that those were the words he spoke, but he never outright denied them either. He preferred to let his people have faith in how his conversation had gone through, in how his conversation had turned out. People even said that every time he walked past it, he'd smile and run his fingers over the golden letters. Even though the planet was indeed feudal, they weren't exactly living in the Dark Ages. They had these massive sky traffic towers, specifically in Vharadesh, with glowing scanner consoles that tracked everything in orbit. Somehow they knew how to maintain that and that alone. But what the people really cared about was the news. They had this whole weird network of astropaths, psychic messengers who would beam back updates on the word bearer's conquests. They were a truly strange mix of future and past, almost resembling Dune if anything. Every time the Legion conquered a new world, the Covenant would declare a planet-wide celebration. And while it sounds beautiful, you have to realize that they were celebrating the compliance, aka the violent takeover of a culture in the name of the Emperor, and their forced compliance into religion. Now, the official story of Lorgar's origins on the world are a little less muddy than some of the others. The official story comes from a noted Imperial historian, stating that Lorgar arrived on a fiery comet and smashed right into Covenant's main temple. But there's another, creepier story. One where a strange, golden-skinned child just showed up at the temple doors one day, asking to be taught about their religion. Which one is true? Well, the answer is probably in the Liber Melium, the book so dangerous and blasted that it's sealed in the deepest vaults on Terra, where it can never be opened again. Whenever a story involves a forbidden book that must never be read, or the history of one of the 9 devils, which is another name for the traitor Primarchs, it's stored in that book. And Lorgar didn't just join the Covenant, he took it over. He was so charismatic and his holy oratory was so powerful that he split the entire planet in two. Not literally, more of a religious schism. This led to something that was creatively named the Schism Wars, a 6-year stint of horrific planet-wide holy war. It was where the old faith, the Chaos worshippers, fought against Lorgar's God-sworn worshippers of the Emperor, though they didn't know the Emperor was the Emperor yet, but Lorgar had had visions of the Emperor. So yeah, they were worshipping the Emperor before they were worshipping the Emperor. And worshippers of the Emperor had been fighting Chaos since before we knew what Chaos was. But eventually, despite the bloodbath, Lorgar won. And less than a year later, a sky-born vessel descended with a trail of fire. And so the prophecy was fulfilled. The Emperor arrived, flanked by Magnus the Red, and Lorgar quickly dropped to a knee, recognizing the man from his visions. The tragedy of it all is that the moment Lorgar knelt, he basically signed the planet's death warrant. For a few years under his direct rule, the planet prospered. But the moment the Emperor gave Lorgar his legion and sent him into the stars, Lorgar was forced to leave the planet under the command of the clergy. And before you know it, they blew it. Religious fundamentalism not seen for generations. Without Lorgar to hold the strings, civilization just collapsed in on itself, reverting back to their own ways. They stopped innovating. They stopped maintaining technology. They let the planet backslide into the broken feudal state that Lorgar had originally found them in. By the time the Heresy started, Colchis was a shell of its former self. It was a place of unstable warp routes, missing fleets, and a world that was too backwards even for the traders. It's almost as if the planet knew its time was up the moment Lorgar left. Lorgar wanted to build a planet of peace, but all he really built was a temple to a god who would eventually be the reason the temple was leveled. And so we've reached the end of the line for Colchis, and honestly, it's one of the most eye for an eye moments in the entire lore. After the Horus Heresy in 014 M31, the Imperium didn't just go back to business as usual. They went on something that is known as the Great Scouring, a galactic-wide, undeniably destructive revenge tour. Around 032 M31, the Ultramarines finally showed up to Colchis. They hadn't forgotten what Lorgar's sons had done to their own worlds, in particular Calth, and they weren't just there to negotiate. Ironically enough, what they found was a dying world, all its industry gone, its people just waiting. But the Inquisition with the Ultramarines didn't just see them as victims. They saw a population that had been breathing in chaos for centuries, and they decided that there was no saving the place. So they quickly ordered Exterminatus. The Ultramarines battle barge, known as Octavius, moved into position and unleashed a horde of cyclonic torpedoes. Colchis' unique geological makeup caused it to go boom, turning out to be the final nail of the coffin. So Colchis didn't just die. It cracked like an egg and was deleted from the physical universe altogether. Today, the coordinates are a closely guarded secret by the Inquisition, a literal ghost in Segmentum Pacificus that has officially never existed. But Lorgar and his word bearers weren't gone. They just moved to a new home. And that house, it was arguably one of the most unsettlingly creepy places in all the Hour of Terror, a demon world known as Sicarius. If Colchis was a world of grey flowers, Sicarius is a world of fire, blood, and brimstone. Imagine a planet where there isn't a single inch of natural ground left. The entire surface is covered in sprawling cathedrals built to the ruinous powers where sacrifices to them are done hourly. A place of sanctuary in a place of freedom, in a place where our enemies can never touch. This was Cor Ferron's statement upon arriving on Sicarius with his demon Primarch. The scale of this world is kind of hard to wrap your head around, as there are millions upon millions of slaves continuously building new spires, not just in empty places, but literally building spires on top of spires on top of spires. It's a literal chaotic mountain of Gothic architecture, miles upon miles high, and the cities are actually subterranean labyrinths devoted to the worship of the chaos gods. The capital itself, if you can call it that, is the Basilica of the World, a fortress crowned with a 5-kilometer high barbed spire. And because, well, 40k is going 40k, those spikes aren't for decoration. They're covered in countless living sacrifices, as the ultimate expression of Lorgar's current obsession. A world that's a giant screaming prayer for the 4 gibbering gods. And what about Lorgar himself? Is he still there? Well, he is. In particular, he's deep inside the Templum Infeco. The demon Primarch has spent several millennia in total solitude and meditation. He's not leading his armies or giving great speeches anymore. He's just sitting in a little dark room, hiding away from Corvus Corax, while his legion uses other worlds such as Galmec as hellish factories deep within the Maelstrom in order to aid in the launching of Black Crusades. Lorgar remains effectively a ghost, ironically enough, doing the exact same thing he did on Colchis, as he started his own journey as a golden child within a desert temple, looking for God to worship, and it ended with a shattered planet and a demon king sitting in a cathedral of bone, blood, and mire, waiting for a future that might never come, so he could worship his new gods, which were, ironically enough, the same old gods he had at one point tried to destroy. And if you stayed till now, thanks. Liking, commenting, and hyping the video would really help me out in the algorithm. And subscribing is a great way to stay up to date with what I post.